Hi, good evening. I'm Ben Withers. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and on behalf of the college and the Department of Philosophy, I welcome you to the second annual spring lecture of the Bodaken Philosophy Symposium. I want to thank Maude, Maury, where are you? Over here, who helped lead the committee in the Department of Philosophy that put this together. So thank you for all your work. The symposium this year is focused on the theme of economic inequality, well-being, and democracy. This work has been made possible by Mr. Bruce Bodaken, a CSU alumnus and philosophy major who understands that the analytical thinking, reading, and writing skills learned in the philosophy classroom add value both to society as a whole and to the individuals who successfully apply this learning to their work and lives. Mr. Bodaken left CSU with these skills and put them to good use. First, in his successful career as leader in the health insurance industry, which culminated in his role as president, chairman, and CEO of Blue Shield of California. And now he continues to share his skills in the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, where his graduate courses focus on leadership, ethics, and healthcare topics such as universal health coverage. We appreciate his thoughtfulness, so please join me in thanking him for his generous support of CSU and the Department of Philosophy. Please. Our distinguished guest this evening is Professor Jonathan Wolff. For many years, Professor Wolff was a professor of philosophy and Dean of Arts and Humanities at University College London. He is now the Blavatnik Chair in Public Policy and Governing Body Fellow at Wolfson College at the University of Oxford. He began his academic career as a student of the well-known political philosopher G.A. Cohen, and has over the course of his work pursued some of the same themes on which his teacher was so influential: distributive justice, the nature of inequality, the writings of Karl Marx. On these topics, Professor Wolff has made a name for himself, but he has also branched out beyond the abstract theorizing for which philosophers are best known. Sorry, Maude, those are words that he let me know there. Marx famously wrote that, quote, "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." In his work, Professor Wolff has shown that it is possible both to interpret the world in illuminating ways and to change it in positive ways. While contributing to the philosophical literature via dozens of articles and books, he has been a member of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, the Academy of Medical Science working on drug futures, the Gambling Review Body, and the Homicide Review Group. Hopefully you won't put any of that to work here tonight. He has also served as an external member of the Board of Science of the British Medical Association and a trustee of the Responsible Gambling Trust. And in 2009, he presented a BBC radio series about the United Kingdom's National Health Service. His work on disadvantage, poverty, disability, and inequality displays both the analytical rigor and deep interest and concern for what makes us uniquely human. In short, his work exemplifies the engaged scholar. He contributes to philosophical literature while simultaneously helping governments govern better and citizens to better understand the world. We are honored to have him with us this evening to deliver his lecture, "Can We Fix Institutional Injustices like Racism, Sexism, and Poverty?" Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Wolff.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, and I'm so delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the department, sponsor, for this invitation. So let me start by reading a passage to you from a book published in 1967. When white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that is an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of the society. But when in that same city, Birmingham, Alabama, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually because of conditions of poverty and discrimination in the black community, that is a function of institutional racism. When a black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is stoned, burned, or routed out, they are victims of an overt act of individual racism which many people will condemn, at least in words. But it is institutional racism that keeps black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative slumlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. The society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation or is incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. Okay, so that was from a book I said published in 1967 by Kwame Ture and Michael Hamilton. It's Black Power. At that time, the time of writing, Kwame Ture was writing under the name of Stokely Carmichael. And I was astonished after having decided to use this passage to look up to see if there was any connection between Colorado and Kwame Ture. And of course, some of you will have seen the film Black Klansman, which is set with opening scenes in Colorado College. And there's a scene at a nightclub where Ture is giving a speech. So it's just a remarkable coincidence for me to be delivering this passage to you and see that connection. Okay, so the distinction that's made in that passage is between individual incidents of racism and something called institutional racism. And I use it primarily because this is thought to be the first use or first systematic examination of the idea of institutional racism, which is a term we hear so much today, but rarely attributed, I think. And it is something like institutional racism I want to talk about today, but something a little bit more general. So I want to talk about not just institutions, but broader structures within society. And I don't want to talk just about racism, but injustice more broadly. And so what I'm going to say will link with a literature on structural injustice, which is beginning to come to the attention of many philosophers at the moment. So the first question is, what do I mean by a structure? And what I have in mind is that a structure is at least a type of persistent pattern of behavior. It tends to repeat, and it involves the behavior of people in different roles. Those people have incentives to continue to act in particular ways. And so structures can be very difficult to break out of. You can be in what seems to you to be an oppressive structure, but there's no obvious way out of it. And we have structures, racism we've already seen, but structures of sexism, for example. Many women object to the norms of beauty and makeup, for example, that they have to follow, but find that in many roles in life they will be punished if they don't obey those norms. So by following those norms, they are reinforcing them, and the pattern repeats and becomes harder and harder for others to break. So that is the sort of thing that I'm talking about, a pattern of behavior which is self-reinforcing, often against really the will of the people who are operating within it. Now, structures can be beneficial, but more often we're interested in these types of structures when they're harmful. And we often see patterns of behavior that are harmful perhaps for everyone. Climate change may well be an example of this, that it is costly, difficult to break the norms that lead to climate change. By repeating behavior, we make it worse. Even more so perhaps for economic crisis or a housing shortage, people behave in ways that they will just expect to be able to behave in, and that harms, in some cases, everyone. So for economists, this is an example of public goods problem. For people in political science, perhaps a tragedy of the commons. So I'm interested not just, though, in structural harms, but in what I've already called structural injustices. And a structural injustice is where one group benefits from the harm that is done to another group through these patterns. And I think we will agree that many structural injustices are pervasive throughout society. What I want to do is to look really at three questions. How do they arise? Why do they persist? And what types of opportunities, avenues do we have to break them, if we can? So let me start with the first question. How does structural injustice arise? How does it come into being in the first place? Now, there's not one answer to this, and there will be perhaps many more answers than the ones I'm just going to mention. But there are three different mechanisms, I think, that it's worth at least highlighting at this point. In some cases, structural injustices come into being purely through a type of ideology. And that's almost certainly what has happened with respect to racism, with respect to patriarchy. So there is a dominant ideology in society that is reinforced, and it has subtle and less subtle mechanisms by which it is reinforced. There's a fascinating recent book by the philosopher Kate Mann called Down Girl. It's a strange title. I think the idea is it picks up what you say to your dog, down boy, this is down girl. Okay. So she's written Down Girl, and the thesis of the book is that misogyny is the way patriarchy is policed. So what does she mean? Well, we have in all societies patriarchal societies. What happens to women if they try to challenge the injustice they see in their lives or in other women's lives? Very often they're ridiculed, very often they're put down, very often they're put back in their place. So misogyny is a way of keeping women in their place, making sure that they do not challenge the dominant ideology, or if they do, they are punished for it. And it will not surprise you to hear that Kate Mann uses the behavior of the President of the United States as a way of illustrating her thesis here. Okay. So there can be an ideology-led and reinforced type of structural injustice. And the interesting thing about this is that there may not be anything deceptive in it. That many of the men who are dominant believe, perhaps at some level, that they have a right to be dominant. This is the natural order of the world. White supremacists very often believe that they have a type of entitlement. So there's an ideology which is led, and people who think they're doing the right thing by reinforcing it. Sometimes, though, there is something closer to a type of conspiracy whereby people don't care whether it's the right thing or not. They simply want to get advantages for themselves. And that's a second type of mechanism. It's a conspiracy rather than ideology-led mechanism. There's a third one, though, which I think may even be more common, at least as a form of origin, and this is what I'm just going to call drift. Patterns of behavior we fall into without even realizing what's going on. One of my favorite examples of this comes from something written not so far away from here, written in Mexico by Leon Trotsky in commenting on the planned economy after Stalin, or during Stalin's reign. And something Trotsky says is that however well-motivated the allocator is, however benevolent the allocator is, there's one thing we can be sure of, that the allocator will never forget himself. So if you're handing things out, if you're responsible, if you're in power, even if you're trying to be as even-handed as you can be, you may leave other groups out, you may forget about other people, you may forget about a whole range of other things, but you will not forget you and people like you. Not because you're selfish, not because you're deliberately trying to do anything wrong, but your own interests come to the fore. And so it's not surprising that power works to the advantage of those who have it, even if they think that is not going to be the case. I'm going to look at that in much more detail as we go along. Okay, so that was just a quick sketch of 3 different ways in which structural injustice can arise. A deliberate ideology, where people believe they're doing the right thing. A type of conspiracy, where people don't care whether they're doing the right thing, they're just trying to follow their own interests. And thirdly, a type of drift, where even though people believe they're doing the right thing, they will favor their own interests. Now, once structural injustices exist, they can be spotted. They can be seen to be unjust. Racism, sexism, and poverty, I haven't mentioned yet. Very few people are going to regard these as tolerable. Well, I say very few people, I should take that back. Very few people in this room will regard them as tolerable and will think they need to be changed. And of course, this includes people with a considerable degree of power in some cases. So why do they persist? I've been told I have to drink a lot of water, so excuse me for doing this. Well, I'm a great believer in people doing things out of thoughtlessness rather than conspiracy in many cases. So one reason for persistence is people just don't notice. People don't understand what is going on. And so one of the great advantages of social science, of philosophy, of other forms of critical thinking is to try to reveal the way in which structural injustice can exist and what can be done about it. And thoughtlessness goes a long way here, that people often think they're doing what is right or even behaving in ways that are encouraged. But behaving in those ways can reinforce the pattern. One of the major writers on this topic, Iris Marion Young, in her book Justice and the Politics of Difference, uses some ideas of structural injustice and in later work gives some clearer examples. So one of the examples that I believe from discussions I had earlier today with some of the students here will resonate with some people in this room again. Young talks about the case of a woman, a fictional woman she calls Sandy. Now, Sandy is a single mother who has a fairly low income, and her landlord is gentrifying the area in which she lives, and she is required to move out. She doesn't mind. She doesn't like the apartment very much. She wants to move closer to work. So off she goes, and everything works against her. She can't raise the deposit for the new flat. She needs to buy a car for work, so her disposable income goes down. And by a number of small steps, she finds herself homeless. How can that happen? Well, it can happen very easily because we just haven't set up the world in a way in which everyone can get what they need from it. Okay, so she suffers from certainly a harm. Many people would think it's an injustice. Who's at fault? Is it her landlord? Well, you can hardly blame a commercial landlord for wanting to get the best out of their property. Is it the people who are renting these newly done up, newly developed properties? Well, it's hard to blame them. They're just young professionals. They want to move into a mixed neighborhood. They thought they were doing the right thing by moving out of the suburbs and into the city. And so on. You see a lot of people making their own decisions for their own reasons, but what it does is add up to an accumulation of circumstances which is very harmful for this person in particular. And of course, the point is it generalizes to a whole group like her. So there's a type of thoughtlessness where people just don't know, don't realize that what they're doing is going to lead to an accumulation of harm. But equally, they also know that even if they didn't do it, for most of them, nothing would change. So if some of the younger people who decide to move in the city read this and said, well, no, we won't do that anymore, that's not going to make the difference for Sandy, because there'll be plenty of other people who will want to be renting those apartments. Okay, so thoughtlessness leads to great harm for some people and some probably relatively small benefits for others. There's another situation which is distinct from this, whereby we know what we need to do. So, for example, I'll discuss poverty in a bit. Probably, if we got half a dozen of us together and had a couple of days, we could come up with some pretty good schemes for ending poverty, or at least reducing it. The difficulty isn't dreaming up the answers, it's working out how we can possibly get there from where we are now. So when you understand some of the problems of structural injustice, it can be completely daunting to think about how can we move towards it. So we can understand the goal, but not necessarily imagine the steps to get where we need to get. But there's another mechanism of persistence which I would like to highlight, which I think is particularly interesting. And we can be in a structure where some people do have the power to make change. We can have a structure where relatively wealthy people could lobby for increased tax, they could be more moderated in their salary demands, they could try to lobby and fund campaigns to increase public services. They have in their power a number of possible mechanisms that would lead to improvement. But at least some of these people don't do that because they feel that their own position is quite justified. Now, the mechanism, I think, it's worth dwelling on here, is if you think about people who are very successful in life, you ask them to explain their success. It's very rare you're going to hear someone who said, well, I found these people who were holding property that they didn't realize the value of, and I managed to trick them into selling it to me for less than it was worth. They're not going to say, well, I had this company, I worked out a way of gouging my workers on their wages, and for 25 years I exploited everyone ruthlessly. Right? So people who are successful do not want to believe that they are in the position they're in through injustice, on the whole. Some people might be happy with that. Some people might not even want to enter the debate about justice. But my conjecture is that a large number of people who are successful will find ways of justifying their success. It's to avoid the cognitive dissonance of believing this very uncomfortable thing that you are where you are through injustice. What this leads to is a type of ideology of justification of your own position. And so even if you see yourself in a structure where you're very successful and other people are not, even if you can see other people may be harmed through this, you might think, nevertheless, you're morally justified in retaining your own privilege. I will come back to this because I think this is an area where philosophy can help us think through. There's also another situation where people who have the potential power to make changes deliberately obscure things so those changes are not made. I mentioned earlier to people I've been talking to that a few years ago I gave a talk, similar occasion to this, at another university. It was a joint talk between the philosophy department and the public health department. And because it was part of the medical school, I was sent a form to declare my conflicts of interest. I haven't been asked to do that tonight, by the way. But if you're talking in the medical school, you had to fill in a declaration of the conflicts of interest. So they emailed me through the form, and I emailed back to them, I think there's a typo in this form, because it said, I did not have to declare a conflict of interest if I'd been working for a pharmaceutical company, a private hospital, a private blood bank, a health consultancy, and a number of other things where the most obvious conflicts of interest would have been. So I said to them, surely that's what you want me to. And they just emailed back and said, no, the form is correct. So I had to declare that I was a member of the Nuffield Council for Bioethics as a potential conflict of interest, and not that I'd been doing some consultancy work for Pfizer. Okay. So what's going on there? So there's a type of corporate capture of the conflict of interest policy, that the donors to the university, or some donors to the university, made it very clear that they would not continue to donate if they had to have a conflict of interest declared against them if people were working for them. And that worked out to whole areas. So what you have here is, I really couldn't believe it. I'd heard someone give a lecture saying this sort of thing is going on in the United States. I thought, that's exaggerated, that's ridiculous, that can't possibly happen. Then about 3 months later, I saw just this small example of where it did happen, where there are deliberate attempts to hide conflicts of interest. And what makes it worse is the university can say, of course, we've got a conflict of interest policy here. So if there are any conflicts of interest, they'll be declared, but there's nothing declared, so there's no conflict of interest. So you have a situation where you have a deliberate conspiracy to keep, I'm not saying there was a structural injustice going on, but this is a sort of mechanism that can be used to hide injustices at a certain level. What else happens? So far I've said structural injustices persist because of thoughtlessness, because people can't imagine how to make changes, because people with the power to change believe their position is just, the people with the power to change deliberately obscure the situation. Something I read as a teenager, which didn't make much sense to me at the time, but I understand a lot more now. Someone wrote a letter to the newspaper that I read saying, why is it that the leaders of the trade union movements in the United Kingdom always end up in the House of Lords? Okay, so I thought, well, it's obvious why, because they put in a lot of good service and they deserve it, right? But of course, the thought was, the letter writer was, this is held out to you, and that if you don't press the trade union interest too much, if you don't rock the establishment too much, we'll give you this big reward, which comes with a lot of prestige, small amount of money, not a huge amount of money, but a very pleasant way of spending your retirement as being a member of the British House of Lords. Also, of course, people are explicitly punished for trying to challenge the rules. And they can be de facto punished in different ways. So the text I started with, Black Power, is full of examples of actual physical violence against black activists who tried to challenge white supremacy. These days, we're more likely, even though we still see some of that, we're more likely to see threatening behavior, but also verbal abuse, particularly using social media. So those who speak out are stigmatized, they're bullied, subject to personal attack. But also the very nature of a structural injustice or a structure means that patterns are reinforced, and it's very hard to do anything about it. One of my favorite examples of this is actually in Marx, in Capital Volume 1. And for those of you who haven't read Marx, Capital Volume 1, I would suggest if you're ever going to do that, skip the first 200 pages or so about economics and move to the sociology and history in the middle of the book. Because there's fabulous, about 300 pages, where Marx is talking about the struggle for the normal working day in England in the 19th century. And to give you some sense of what the working life was like, there were rules regulating the employment of children under the age of, I think, 8. And in the cotton mills in the north of England, children as young as 3 were employed, and the mills couldn't function without them because they were used to clean out the ventilation shafts. So these small children would crawl through the ventilation shafts to clean them out, and as you can imagine, that was not a healthy environment. They had a very short life for doing that. But if you were employing children so young, the hours were regulated, and you couldn't work them and therefore anyone else more than about, I think it was 80 or 90 hours a week at that time. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. This is the length of the working day. Now, some of the major manufacturers said they wanted to reduce the working day and that they were quite prepared to do that. But they also said that they couldn't do it, because if they did, they would lose out to the competitors who didn't, and they would go out of business. And so given the state of the law, they had no alternative but to continue to employ children and the factories for that length. And what was interesting is that they were lobbying Parliament to pass a law to reduce the working day, because only then could they reduce their own working day, because there wouldn't be competition from others. So you've got this situation where even if you want to stop doing what you're doing, you cannot do it and stay in business. So today, a business person who wants to increase wages can only do that to a certain point, because if profits fall too low, they won't be able to reinvest, they'll fall to other competitors. So there's a type of constant race to the bottom, and people can feel incredibly guilty about that. So there is a type of set of circumstances that make these structural factors repeat and repeat and make it very hard for there to be any type of resistance. So what can be done in the face of this set of considerations that will reinforce, fossilize structures, including unjust structures? What can be done? I mean, it feels almost like a council of despair to this point. And one thing you see in a lot of the philosophical literature is people pointing out structural injustices and then just waving their hands when you think about, well, what's going to happen next? And I have to admit, that was a character of quite a lot of my work before I was semi-forced to confront this more head-on. So what can be done? Well, I want to take inspiration from a rather unusual place. The notion of a structure is maybe an engineering metaphor or even an architectural metaphor. And this, I think, can be quite helpful in thinking through the types, at a very abstract level, the types of strategies that might be possible. So let me tell you about a book that was written in 1913 by, in fact, an Australian woman who was working in the UK called Maude Pemba Reeves. Now, Maude Pemba Reeves was part of a movement to try to improve the conditions of some of the poorest people in London, and she managed to gather funds together to try to improve their condition. And in 1913, she wrote a book called Round About a Pound a Week, because a pound a week was the amount of money that these households had to live on. And she describes the living conditions, working conditions, and the lives of the people living in this part of London. In fact, I used to live very close to the area she's talking about. Of course, it had undergone gentrification by the time I got there, but it was a notorious part of London at that point. And in 1913, in the poorer homes, illumination was largely by candlelight. The families had very little cooking facilities, very few clothes. The children and the man of the house often only had one serviceable set of clothes. And the lives of the mothers, wives, the women of the house were lives of drudgery, that pretty much as soon as anyone came home from work or school, they took off their clothes and gave them to the mother to mend for the day. So every day there was mending of clothes to send people back to work or school the next day. Every evening was an evening of mending. Now, the project that Maude Pemba Reeves was involved with included other visitors, other well-meaning middle-class women visiting the homes of the poor to understand what was going on, to take notes and to give advice. And the passage that really interested me was one where one of her workers, one of the middle-class women, went to visit a very poor family that were living in a basement with no windows in one room. And one of the great problems was the quality of air in those dwellings, that the cooking was over an open fire, and the atmosphere was stifling, particularly in the summer. The visitor reports that in this particular room there was a very heavy wallpaper on the walls. And the visitor suggested to the woman of the house that she should remove the wallpaper and replace it with distemper, which I think is like a lime wash. The reason for that was the thought was, I don't know if this is true, but getting rid of the paper and just putting paint would make the room feel lighter and airier. In reply, the woman of the house said, get rid of the paper, replace it with paint. That wouldn't keep the bugs out for a minute. So this was a very shocking passage for me, in that thinking, is that why we have wallpaper? To keep the insects in the walls. I'd never heard of that before, but maybe it was. I don't know. And Maude Pemba Reeves says, maybe there is nothing that can be done to get rid of the bugs other than burning down the houses. Okay. So this is a very radical suggestion here. We have in this case, not an unjust structure, but we have an unsanitary structure. And the only thing that can be done about it is burning down the house and starting again, building again. And this really is the revolutionary impulse, I think, to think that things are so rotten in society, the only thing we can do is to burn down society and start all over again. But that does seem to me to be maybe not the first thought we should have when we're thinking about a structural problem with a house. What's very interesting to me, though, in this is when you start thinking about a structural problem in a house, what do you do about it? Well, one thing you could do temporarily is paper over the cracks. A crack appears in the house, you can put paper over it. And we use that as a metaphor, of course, of papering over the cracks. What happens if you paper over the cracks? The crack reappears. So all you've done is made a cosmetic difference. You haven't got to the structural problem. You need to do something much more substantial in order to overcome that difficulty. It might not be burning down the house, probably not. Many structures can be improved. But something much more thoroughgoing needs to be done in order to bring about some sort of repair. So, what do we do about poverty? Where are we trying to get to? Well, let me read out another passage, this time from a development economist from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, Arthur Lewis, who worked much of his time in the UK. And he wrote a book called The Principles of Economic Planning. And just in passing, he describes what he calls a socialist view. Now, I can't work out from the book whether he actually endorsed this, but it's an account of what he thinks socialists want. And he's writing in 1949, or published in 1949. So what the socialists want, he says, is a society in which every child shall grow up in pleasant homes and attractive surroundings and with good educational opportunities, in which every adult shall be provided for in sickness and adversity, and in which the pensioner can take untroubled ease, he says. So that is Arthur Lewis's account of what a sort of minimum good society would offer everyone. Pleasant environment for the children with good educational opportunities, a type of sickness and unemployment insurance for the adults, and a pension that allows pensioner to take untroubled ease. So it's a sort of suburban goal here. It may not be what everyone thinks is what would make their life good, but I think the thought is rather that if everyone had this, then it would give them a certain level of comfort and security. And it's rather shaming to think that, what are we, 70 years later, and so few societies have managed to achieve this on a general basis. That every child should grow up in pleasant homes and attractive surroundings is true probably almost nowhere. So those goals, I said earlier, if we put 6 of us, 7 of us together for a couple of days, we could come up with ideas about how to overcome poverty. This may well be one of the alternatives we have to the world that we're living in. So we can identify alternatives. That's not the problem. Our problem is, how can we get to those alternatives? How can we change the structures to do the type of repair to our societies that we need to do? So we need to know how can it be done, what transformations are available, and who can do it. And it's very likely that this will be doubly pluralistic. There'll be many different mechanisms, many different ways of attempting it. That sounds optimistic. On the other hand, the task can seem completely daunting. I mean, if we go back to the original example of institutional racism, what do we do about institutional racism? Well, the authors of Black Power talk about racism in the police in the United States in the 1960s. And what they point out is that it's very easy to to fire a few racist policemen. It's very easy to do that. What's going to happen? Nothing. Because other racist policemen will fill those jobs. That's what it is for the police force to be institutionally racist, rather than it being just a few rogue police who you can get rid of. Why would it be like that? Well, because if you're in a racist organization, it's very hard not to be racist. That the jokes that other people will be telling will be racist, the types of behavior that's rewarded will be racist behavior, the sorts of behavior that will be punished will be anti-racist behavior. If you're calling out your bosses, that's no good. If you're calling out your colleagues, you'll be punished for that in different ways. So a whole form of mechanisms will come into place that will just repeat where we are. So it will be a really enormous task to take on this project of repair, so it seems. However, I think we can take some comfort. And here I want to use an image that was put forward by the feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye of a bird cage and how a bird is trapped in a bird cage. Now, after reading this, I realized bird cages are much more interesting than I ever thought they were. Because if you think, what is it that traps a bird in a bird cage? There's no single wire that is keeping the bird there. You could remove any one of the wires, and the bird most likely will remain. You could remove quite a lot of the wires, and the bird will still be trapped. You need to remove a combination. You need to undo, in other words, quite a lot of things to make any discernible progress, even though with every wire that's taken away, some progress is being made. So you've got an interesting situation here where you can make progress, but it's quite hard to detect until you get to a type of threshold point. So we can be very disillusioned because we do lots of things and it doesn't seem to be making any difference. That could be like peeling back one wire at a time. And it's not until there are a combination of things that are done, maybe by many people at many different times, where we'll lead to any type of change. So what sorts of things can lead to change? Well, sometimes change happens just on its own. Erving Goffman, writing in 1963, in his book Stigma, gave examples of stigmatized groups in America at that time. If you were Irish, apparently, or if you were divorced, you were a member of a stigmatized group. As I understand it, those stigmas have long gone now. So there's just certain things about the way society develops under its own logic that will mean there'll be some improvements. There are also lots of small things that can be done that can make things better. And here is a tiny, tiny example from when I was dean of the faculty at my last university. Now, one thing that many universities worry about is the lack of representation of women at the most senior roles in the university. So we had something called the senior management team, which was the highest committee in the university, and the way that the university was run, all deans were members of the senior management team. And every now and again, a vacancy would come up, but there would be relatively few women candidates and also particularly relatively few younger female candidates. And this was disappointing for us, so I spoke to a number of my colleagues to ask them if they would consider standing for dean when the vacancy came up. And quite a few of them said no, they couldn't. So why was that? Well, women with young children did not like the fact that we had our senior management team meetings at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. Now, schools start later in the UK than in the US, I think. At 8:30 is a time when you're getting your kids to school. Very interesting that there were men on the senior management team who had young kids at school. That seemed okay. But for women, the idea of managing your life to get the kids to school and to get to the senior management team meeting on the same day was just not worth the agony. Of course, there was the occasional woman who could do this, that had a nanny, a rich partner, say. And so that meant it was possible, but for most people it was just not worth it. So I spoke to some of the other people on the senior management team and said, why do we have the meeting at 8:30? And one of the answers was, well, we always have had it at 8:30, and people like to get it over with so you get the rest of your day. Okay. And I said, well, have you thought of changing it? And they said, yes, we had that discussion a few years ago, but we decided not to. I thought, well, we better have this discussion again, really. Because why did we have the meeting at 8:30? Largely, I think, because we like to complain about having to come in for an 8:30 meeting. And that was about the only reason I could think of, because it showed how macho we were, how we deserved our bigger salaries than other professors got. We were really showing we were doing something for the university by coming in. And it was having the effect that most women just could not see how they could manage this with their lives. Okay, so we changed the meeting time to 10 o'clock. I didn't get the benefit of this because I left that job before it came through. I don't know if it's made any difference. It probably hasn't made any difference at all. But it's one obstacle that has been taken away. And you need to start thinking about things we do for no good reason that are putting obstacles in the place of other people. Okay, so each of us can do certain things, particularly if we're in a position of limited power. Pride movements are very important, self-advocacy, political leadership is an obvious thing. If the right leader comes in, very big changes can be made. Charismatic leadership is also an interesting area. Now we have a number of celebrities who are quite prepared to put themselves in the public eye, to campaign and so on. One of the great examples of this in the UK was a moment when Princess Diana went to an HIV clinic and shook hands with a man who was HIV positive. And at that time, in the popular press, you were told, don't go anywhere near anyone who's HIV positive. You will put yourself at great risk for doing that. People would dress up in almost like space suits to meet people who were HIV positive. She had been given medical advice to say there was no risk, and she did this, and there was a photograph of her that went round the world, I think, and that had a really good effect in terms of demystifying and making some social progress. So things can be done that way. Obviously, political activism is another area. More recently, I have got quite interested in the idea of art as a form of political change, political protest. The Albanian philosopher who now works in London, Leah Yippi, wrote a book on what she calls avant-garde political agency, and her role model is Picasso here, and Picasso's Guernica as a painting which changed people's perceptions of war. And we have a whole range, actually, of philosophers talking about different forms of art and the way this can have some social goal. Tommy Shelby, a Harvard philosopher, talks about the power of hip-hop. If we go further back, Audre Lorde made a very interesting observation that poetry is almost a type of revolutionary art form. you can be a poet when you're poor. It's very hard to be a novelist if you're poor. You can be a poet when you're holding down another job. Being a novelist, you can't. So there's something quite powerful about poetry as a form of art. And I would also say that in this country, the program Saturday Night Live might be the major force of the opposition that you have here. And we should not underestimate this. Plato wanted to exile the poets from the Republic. Why was that? Every totalitarian society has wanted to engage in censorship. And censorship has been quite a common part of our lives right up until maybe the late 20th century. I'm going to move on just to two last types of strategies that are more philosophical. So I said earlier, people in power who don't want to believe that their position is held unjustly often find rationales, reasons to justify their position. So they have a type of privilege. They don't want to believe their privilege is unjustified, so they look for arguments that will support their position. And sometimes those arguments perhaps are justified, but very often they will be a type of illusory form of self-justification. So one of my favorite examples of this goes back all the way to 1700 and the early feminist writer Mary Astell. Now, Astell was confronting an argument that men are naturally rulers of women because in Genesis, God created men before he created women. And that was therefore a reason why men should have rule over women. Well, Astell points out that according to Genesis, the creeping things were created before men, and no one says the creeping things should have power over men. So this is a really powerful argument. It probably made no difference, of course. But at an intellectual level, it just shows how paper-thin that attempt at justification is. Of course, there are going to be replies. Something that has come up a lot in recent literature under the name is the myth of meritocracy. So this is quite an interesting position. Again, if you ask anyone how they got into their very privileged position, they may well tell you that they had to work very hard for it. And that, in many cases, is true. People who are very wealthy often do have to work incredibly hard. And so it's easy to think that they got where they were because of their hard work. But what they often forget is that other people work just as hard as them and don't get rich. And what happens is the combination of having a certain set of social circumstances and hard work gives you a chance of getting rich, whereby if you're not in those social circumstances, the chance is very much diminished. So in the language of first-year logic, this argument confuses a necessary and a sufficient condition. That is, for many people, it is necessary to work hard in order to get rich. If they didn't work hard, they wouldn't have got rich. But that doesn't mean that working hard is sufficient to get rich, and other people can work just as hard and not get rich. Last unmasking argument, one I've only really come to understand in fairly recently, which is an argument about white privilege. So if you take someone like me, in my upbringing, I grew up in southeast England, in a small town. And the idea that I got any start in life because of white privilege seemed ridiculous, because I just didn't meet people who weren't white for quite a long part of my life. So the idea that somehow I got advantage for that. And as I go through my university career, very, very few people were, other than white, from around the world, but it seemed very strange to me to be told that I've in any way benefited from the color of my skin. But I realized that I was thinking about it the wrong way. And the right way to think about it is, would I have got where I am if my skin hadn't been white? Rather than thinking that it's the white skin that I've got that has advantaged me against the people I was in competition with. If I was different in the UK, if I was Indian or black, would I have got the same opportunities? And almost certainly I wouldn't have done, because so many things at certain points in my life depended on type of personal relations, depending on common culture, depending on being at the pub at the right time with the right people, and so on, hearing about the right opportunity. So there are lots of things whereby that negative argument is a strong one. Okay, so the last argument I want to give about how we can make change is about making the unthinkable thinkable. I think this is really powerful. And to illustrate it, I'm going to give you a quote that I use quite a lot. And this is another UK-Colorado connection, because it's from Alison Jagger, who's a British philosopher who works at University of Colorado, Boulder. And this is from an essay she wrote in the Cambridge Companion to Feminism. And she wrote this in the year 2000, and she's talking about her childhood in England in the 1950s and the 60s. And she says, "As a young woman, I was unable to articulate many vague and confused feelings and perceptions because the language necessary to do so had not yet been invented. The vocabulary I needed included such terms as gender, sex role, sexism, sexual harassment, the double day, sexual objectification, heterosexism, the male gaze, marital acquaintance and date rape, emotional work, stalking, hostile environment, displaced homemaker, and double standard of aging." So all of these terms have been introduced from the 1970s onwards. The most famous example, I think, is the term sexual harassment. This was invented in the 1970s. The circumstances were, as I understand it, that a secretary in an academic department in a medical school was being put under distressing sexual pressure from a professor and found it so upsetting that she had to leave. She applied for some form of welfare, but she was told that she didn't qualify for it because she'd left her job voluntarily. Now, she thought this was very unfair and went to the Women's Legal Advice Center on campus, so academic lawyers, and they thought she had a case. But there was no vocabulary with which to fight the case. So they had to invent a term to say that she left because of something. And apparently they tried out many different terms before eventually they settled on sexual harassment. But like anything in language, we just assume it's been around for as long as language has been around. But if you don't have words like this, you cannot make sense of your experience. And so linguistic innovation, conceptual innovation, is a way of helping people understand the oppression and structures they suffer from. Okay, so I started with Black Power. I'll end with it. As I said, I read it because I saw a reference to it as being the first place where institutional racism was given any sustained analysis. And I thought in reading it, it had quite a reputation as a book, so I thought I would be reading something that had a type of call for revolution in it. And certainly you can pull out lines from it that look like a call for revolution. So, for example, at one point they say, "We reject the assumption that the basic institutions of this society must be preserved." So that sounds rather threatening. We reject the assumption that the basic institutions of this society must be preserved. They also say that they reject the goal of assimilation because it reinforces the racism of dominant society, dominant American society. Well, what do they say? Well, they say there's no one solution, lots of different things, different time, different places, rather like I've done, I suppose. But they have this program that they call political modernization. And they say it includes many things, but by it we mean three major concepts. One is questioning the old values and institutions of society. The second, searching for new and different forms of political structure to solve political and economic problems. They don't present any, they don't have any concrete ideas. They say we need to search for new and different forms of political structure. And finally, broadening the base of political participation to include more people in the decision-making process. Well, what do they mean? Well, there are several chapters of the book which are basically about overcoming the legacy of Jim Crow and getting black voters in the South just on the electoral roll. That is all they're talking about for most of the book, and about the obstacles that have been put in place. So reading this book today, it's really astonishing because it reads a bit like very intelligent liberal egalitarianism. But in its day, it was considered an extremely threatening revolutionary tract. And looking at it again, there's really no basis for that. But for some reason, it scared American society in the 1960s. So we get limited inspiration from Black Power. We see that there are many things that can be done. No single agent or strategy is likely to overcome structural injustice, but there are many things to do. Many wires in many different bird cages, and progress will be very, very slow. And I think this is really the message I want to get across, that if oppression, if structures are like the bird cage, it will be many actions before considerable change is apparent. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. Things are happening in the background. As long as a bird cage doesn't keep repeating, repairing itself under its own weight, which of course it could very often do. Okay, so times change. We're still looking for solutions. We're not there yet, but this is what I have for you today in any case. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Moti Gorin. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy, and my colleague Ashby Butner there has the second microphone. We're going to sort of roam around and take questions. We'll alternate different sides of the room. So just raise your hand if you have a question, and Holmes, you want to go first?
This is a question about the future. You know, some things you think you can get done and get fixed, and we do believe we've made moral progress. But other things you wonder if it's not going to take eternal vigilance forever. There's something in the nature of human nature that means these problems in some form or another are going to return. Are we going to be facing these forms in some way or another 500 years from now?
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that optimistic starting point. Can we fix anything? Are we going to have the same problems in 500 years' time? Okay, so I do take this very seriously as a question. And one of the most depressing things I've had to come to terms with is the way in which if you remove one problem, very often a similar one reappears. So, for example, Freud in Civilization and Discontents say, the communists thought that by leveling property, they would end oppression. I'm afraid I've got bad news for them. Right? Something else will take over. Maybe party membership will become just as important as property was. And so there is a whole range of social psychology called social dominance theory that says that in every society there's ever been, there have been three forms of social hierarchy. One based on age, one based on gender, and a third based on what they call an arbitrary set feature. In other words, anything. It can be religion, it can be skin color, it could be birth, but a hierarchy always emerges. And so for someone who believes in equality as I do, this is one of the most depressing things you could believe, because they also say every time there have been attempts to overcome this, disaster has happened. So what I think is that a type of egalitarian utopia is probably out of reach for us. But I don't think that means that nothing is possible. I think what it means is that we can mitigate some of the worst things. And we see this just in different societies around the world. So a lot of people think of Denmark as a very successful society that has overcome a lot of problems. Iceland, okay, these are tiny, tiny societies, maybe where almost everyone knows each other. But I think things have been better and worse at different times in history. So I think all we can do really is look for the worst cases and think about what we can do to move those in the right direction. But I think we will still have the same problems in 500 years. I know a lot of philosophers, the goal for most philosophers is to set out a theory of justice such that it will put every other philosopher out of business. But I think we're all in business for quite a long time. Yeah.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking lecture. I thought it was very positive, actually, in terms of the future. A couple of questions I have, and I recognized all the terms since the 1970s, so thank you for refreshing some of that. We have new terms today, of course, terms like fake news, presidential harassment. Are these terms that you think we're going to hear or become part of our culture for many years to come, or is this just a fad?
Yeah. Well, I mean, who knows? Who knows? So fake news is actually, I think, a sort of cultural universal. I came across the term yellow news. Do you know yellow news? So this dates from, 1880 or so. It was a part of Hearst's attempt to sell newspapers just by having more gossip than others. So the press is a big issue for us. Obviously, we need a free press, but a free press that exists to sell newspapers is not what we would ideally want to have. I mean, fake news is something we're going to have to try and work our way through. We're not doing very well at the moment, but we're just going to have to think about ways of filtering reliability. But it is a problem. I mean, presumably, many people here are on social media. I've kept away for quite a long time, and I thought I'd better take a look at this, and got hooked like everyone else. And I started off on Twitter, and I thought, I'm not going to be a member of the metropolitan elite liberal bubble. I'm going to follow Breitbart. I'm going to follow the Republicans. I'm going to follow the Brexiteers in the UK. And I did for a while, but I just found it so upsetting, seeing people saying things that were obviously false, obviously racist, and to wake up in the morning and to see some of this on your phone first thing is a horrible way of starting the day. So you can see how people just get polarized into seeing the news they want to see and ignoring everything else. So I think the big problem we've got, I think fake news is part of the problem, but people only seeing those bits of the news they want to see, I think may be a bigger problem, and trying to work out how to have more constructive debate is an issue for us. We're not making much progress on that. Presidential harassment, I'm hoping, is a one-off. And on my Twitter account, my byline is waiting for normal service to be resumed. And I think that normal service may well be resumed at some point, but who knows? So thank you.
Yes. Our current healthcare system in the United States is probably the best example of gross inequality, doing a great amount of damage to individuals and the country in general. What advice would you have for those that are advocating for drastic restructuring of that into a single-payer, improved Medicare for all plan?
Okay. Very good. So, great question. Thank you. So it was mentioned in the introduction that a few years ago, in fact, 11 years ago, I think, I did some radio programs on a philosopher looks at the NHS, the National Health Service. And I came to understand some things about it by doing research for this that I didn't know before. And the mythology we have about the National Health Service in the UK is that it was introduced by a socialist government at the end of the war as a type of egalitarian equalizing scheme for everyone. And certainly it was introduced by a Labour government. But the founding document of the NHS was something called the Beveridge Report that was written earlier. And Beveridge was a liberal, in the British sense of a liberal, so sort of political centrist. And he was an expert on administration, not ideology. And he said that The reason for having a national health service is, so there are two separate arguments. So one question is, why should we have services for the poor, health services for the poor? And basic humanity in every other country apart from the United States that can afford it, so this is not a serious question. That poor people get ill, they can't afford to look after themselves, so other people have to bail them out in that way, resenting it or not resenting it. The interesting question about the NHS is not why do we have an NHS for the poor, it's why do we have an NHS for the rich? So why do you have a national service for people who could afford to pay for their own insurance? Why do you have a national service? And Beveridge's answer to this is that everyone needs that insurance policy. Everyone would have to take it out. But if we had private insurance, we would spend so much energy and money working out who pays for exactly what. That would use up a considerable part of the budget. So we'd be spending a lot of the health budget just working out who has to pay for what. So it's much more administratively efficient to have a single system where you don't worry too much about who's paying for what because the same person's paying for all of it. And then you can get rid of a whole range, or you don't need a whole thousands and thousands of administrators. I read a quote from Obama not long ago when he was asked a question, why don't we just go for a single payer? And one of his answers was that would put 200,000 to 300,000 people out of work if we did that. Right? So some people might think that's a good thing in those circumstances, but of course if you're one of those 200,000 or 300,000, you're not going to think it's a good thing. So that's one point I would say. Think about it not so much as socialized medicine, but just as a way of getting the same services much more cheaply because you don't have to pay so much in administration of it. The other thing I'd say is that I was a bit disappointed with the narrowness of the US healthcare debate because it looked to me, and forgive me, we're just as bad in the UK, but the only alternative models you were prepared to look at were ones where you could read about them in English. And so you looked at Canada, you looked at the UK, you looked at Australia, you looked at New Zealand. You didn't look at Germany, or maybe you did. But Germany has an insurance-based system. And it seems to me that if you're trying to reform the American healthcare system, the German and maybe the French systems are the ones to look at, not the UK and Canada, which are organized on a completely different basis. So I think a broader examination of alternative methods of financing would really be very good. So one thing I tell my students when they're looking at a problem in public policy is that most countries have the same problem. And we shouldn't think about the problem just from our own perspective. We should always look to see how the problem is solved in other countries. We may find that people have got ideas that we have never really looked at. And so a much more comprehensive look at just the OECD countries and how they manage healthcare, I think could give some inspiration there. Okay.
Hi, so I feel like this information is very important for a lot of people to hear. I also know that looking through this audience, I don't see many children, except for myself. So is there a way that this can reach a greater audience, specifically youth?
So when you say this, do you mean what I've just said about healthcare or about the topic of the lecture?
Like, just kind of everything that you said.
Everything I said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
okay.
like, not really anything, like, especially the parts about equality and racism, sexism.
Yeah.
All that.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think philosophers have been desperate to try to get their ideas out into a wider audience, but they don't really know what that means. And so they think writing a blog post is a way of getting things out to a wider audience. Some people have been able to make TV programs. There are YouTube. Have any of you seen Michael Sandel's YouTube programs? I think they've been watched by tens of millions of people. There's a podcast series called Philosophy Bites made in the UK. There are about 200 or 300 podcasts there. They've been downloaded 36 million times, so we're quite proud of that. So they are getting out there. It's just maybe not wide enough. So a lot of the things I've been saying, they go back to the 60s, go back to the 70s, but they haven't got out. But I mean, do you have a view about why ideas like this are not better known?
I mean, I feel like a lot of the times children feel like they're not really involved, like they don't need to know the information because they haven't experienced a lot of the stuff that is talked about. And so, I don't know, I feel like they just don't know about what they're missing and what they should know because they're the next generation. They're going to experience this. It's going to be put on them to like help solve. So I think most of it is lack of knowledge.
Okay. Very interesting. So one of the things I learned when I was dean of my faculty is if you don't know the answer to a question, you say, thank you, that's a really important challenge. Okay. So I will take that as a really important challenge. And we'll see, actually thinking through better communication, political philosophy. People are doing this, people are trying to do it, but the material is there, it's getting to the next stage of getting people actually to read it, I think, is the problem for us. Thank you.
This may be a product of my own muddled thinking, but in addition to just straightforward, unjust structures, part of what I find very paralyzing is when unjust structures are also structures of justice. Democracy, the media. You know, I need them. I'm in this terrible position where I refuse to listen to the news, but I absolutely need to be informed.
Yeah.
There's this coinciding of in a structure of the justice possibilities and the injustice reality.
Good. Okay, that is absolutely right. When you said structures of justice, I thought you were going to talk about the prisons, and racism within the prisons, maybe the way law is enforced. Those are obviously major problems, and there's some now fantastic writing on this. And in that respect, the only good news I've got is I have a book called Ethics and Public Policy. The first edition was about 8 years ago. I'm just in the middle of the second edition, trying to do the second edition, and I've had to update the statistics. And the only bit of good news in the book is that the US prison population hasn't risen in the last 8 years. It is still about 2.2 million people, but it's roughly the same as it was 8 years ago, and 10 times as high as it was maybe 40 years ago. So I think this really is closely related to the fake news issue. How do we restore trust in the media? How can we understand what's going on? And I'm struggling with this as much as anyone else, I think it is already getting a lot of attention. I think, and things like fact-checking sites and instant fact-checking is helpful. I don't know yet, I assume we probably have fake fact-checking sites as well, which is devaluing that particular currency. So it's really difficult. So in the UK, the BBC was for a long time respected as, not completely neutral. Sometimes some people thought it was too far to the left, some people thought it was too far to the right, which meant probably it was just about okay. Our main news program in the morning, Radio 4, almost everyone every middle class British person would wake up to Radio 4, so we'd all have the same news program. Now, a lot of people can't bear it, and we listen to music in the morning instead, and then go onto social media to get our stories from around the world, which reinforces the echo chamber issue. So I think, okay, I can say it again. That's a very important challenge. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. So.
Thank you. It's good? Okay. I want to follow up on what that lovely young lady back there was saying, because I've been thinking about it as you've been talking. I work with a lot of organizations, and the notion of culture is very, very important in those organizations when you have to make change. And I work with Dr. Shine's definition of culture, those things that are taught very consistently. And I'm wondering if you could comment on structure, where structure meets culture, and the things that we teach, because I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it.
So you didn't hear the word culture, that is true. You did hear the word art a few times, very quickly. Painting. I'm doing some work at the moment with a musician about, it's not this project, but it's a project about disability and empowering people through the use of music. When you're talking about culture, do you mean high culture? Or, no, so you mean the culture of a society?
We teach, those defined set of behaviors, we teach them over and over. Where does that meet structure?
Yeah. Okay, so that will be one of the things that reinforces structure. Because the main thing, I think, that reinforces structure is unthinking behavior. Now, unthinking behavior can be very good. It can be not so good. So here, many, many years ago, I was at a conference, and my son, who's now 26, was about 3, and an academic conference, and we put him in a creche for a couple of hours at the conference. And afterwards, the nursery nurses kept coming up to my wife and I and say, your son's really special, your son's really special. And we say, I'm sure you say that to all the parents. Say, no, your son's really special, really special. And so eventually we got one of them to say what was so special about him. And it was that he said please and thank you and took turns. Okay. And these were the kids of academics at an academic conference, right? And so so I found that very shocking. That now, of course, this is a matter of the British culture where you just say that and you don't really mean it, most of the time. But there are ways in which we're bringing up our children. One of my favorite books is by a sociologist called Annette Leroux, and it's called Unequal Childhoods. And it's based in probably Philadelphia, it's a city on the northeast. And part of it is a micro-study of about 12, maybe 12-year-olds, maybe 10 to 12-year-olds. And she split them so half a male, half a female, half black, half white, a third middle class, upper middle class, a third working, and a third poor. And what she did was get her students or research assistants just to live with these families and to watch how they behaved. Lots of very interesting stuff that came out of it. But the thing that really struck me was that so she thought there'd be a big difference on race, there'd be a big difference between these different groups. There was only one difference that they really picked up. And that was between the upper middle class kids and everyone else. And it was the same across race. So what was this big difference? Well, it's what happened to these kids when they came out of school and what the rest of their life was like. So if you were a middle-class kid at this time, I'm sure it's still true now, you would come home from school and you would maybe eat, do your homework if you have any, then you would go off to choir practice, or go off to Little League, or go off to a French lesson, or go off to something that is organized. So every night you would do this. You'd be living by the diary. The house would revolve around a calendar. Whereas for the other kids, their lives weren't like that. They'd come home from school, maybe their parents were working, so they'd go around to their aunts or their grandmothers. They'd be playing with other kids of different ages, be spending much more time with their cousins. And they had this much freer play, which sounds wonderful, and it sounds like they get emotional maturity. But the sting in the tail is that Annette Leroux says that the upper middle class kids are being trained for college and the workforce here. Because they're being trained to live according to a timetable. They're being trained not to let other people down, the importance of the clock, and so on. And they're also being trained how to deal with adults. And so you have, and this then seeps through everything else in their life and determines how they're going to behave and probably how they're going to behave in respect to each other. So I think just these things that no one is even thinking about when you're bringing up your child, these are things that are going to affect how they're going to relate to other people later on. I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say one last thing here, because in the 1920s, the British English political theorist R.H. Tawney wrote a book called Equality, and he was arguing about how bad and rigid the British class system was. And he said one of the big problems is that the people from different classes don't even meet each other as children. So the ruling class never have met the people they're ruling over. They don't know anything about them. And that changed a little bit around time of the Second World War, and there was more cohesion. But the direction seems to be going in the opposite now, and in the US, if you read Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, one of the things he says that is that when he's 70 now, 60 or 70, he said when he was young, rich and poor played together. Now they don't see each other in the streets. They're in different schools. So we're segregating society, and we're just not mixing across. And so that's going to affect how people behave to each other and within their own groups. So these things, which I said, are not noticed. They are hugely significant for how people's lives are going to go. And it's also just as difficult to work out what to do about it as well now. But the first thing is to be conscious of it, give it a name, and think about what we can do from there.
Well, I think we're done for the evening. Let's thank Joe one more time.
Well, thank you once again. A very enjoyable occasion for me, a very useful discussion, so thank you for your hospitality.